In this episode, called Boats Against the Current, we interview Professor Michael J. Thompson, who wrote the book Income Inequality. In it, we take a very philosophical approach to our oligarchical governance. We explore the insidious descent into this state of affairs and consider some ways out. Now, I'm not saying we're going to win the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences, but I have started practicing my acceptance speech. Insert laugh line. But anyway, seriously, let's start the interview, one that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Good afternoon, Michael. Where are you? You're in New York City?
I am in New York, yes.
And Michael, what is your name and what do you do?
My name is Michael Thompson. I am a political theorist. I teach in the Department of Political Science at William Patterson University in New Jersey.
All right. And the book you recently wrote that drew our attraction to you, what's that called?
I believe you mentioned it was the Politics of Inequality book?
Yes. Very timely, if you ask me.
Hmm.
I have to confess, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read most of it, but the reason why I haven't read it all the way through is because I keep rewinding it and listening to it again and again.
Oh, right, okay.
There's words to live by in there.
Okay, great. I'm glad.
All right, so let's get really rudimentary now. Is there income inequality in the United States?
Yes, there's income inequality in the United States.
Throw some stats at me, sir. I bet you got a couple right off the tip of your tongue.
Well, it really depends on what you want to measure. For sure, income inequality is one way that we measure or assess inequalities between individuals within a society. But when you look at the really profound relationship between economic inequality, it's actually much more in the realm of wealth inequality, which is a very, very different thing. So most economists, generally speaking, measure economic inequality by a statistic called the Gini coefficient, and it basically measures the inequality between all members within society with a simple number that goes from 0 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about that is it's usually measured to, it's usually used to measure income, but so in other words, so the statistic goes from 0 to 1. So 0 would be like perfect equality. In other words, there would be no one has a dollar more or a dollar less than anyone else, and 1 would be one where one person has all the wealth and everyone else has nothing, right? Okay. So if you look at it from that perspective, the United States actually does pretty poorly, and the United States, generally speaking, is usually within the about a 7. I'm sorry, 0.7. Getting pretty much toward as close as you really can toward an almost absolute inequality. That the people in the toppest ranks, top 0.1% of the population, that's probably about 400 families.
Okay.
Control, generally speaking, about 60% of the wealth of the entire.
Could you say that again, please?
It's about the 0.1%, top 0.1% of the population. It's about 400 families control about 60% of the wealth of the economy.
And there's how many people in the United States? About
350
million or something?
Yeah, 360 million. It's a remarkable number. It's really so. I think when you look at these numbers, these statistics, they really bring out to you the kind of pyramidal shape of distribution within the society. And then when you look at wealth, which is actually harder to measure because wealth can be calculated in so many different ways. It can be hidden and broken up in different ways. But even with wealth, the problem gets worse. That the wealth inequality, the gradient is even steeper. So really, it's also about ownership. It's about control. There's all these different kinds of ways of measuring it. The ability to control other people's labor, other people's work, for example, is different than, say, owning them, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So
wealth. Wait a second there, Michael. All right. This is why I haven't finished your book. I keep having to rewind. Say that last sentence again. You say these 400 people, they're controlling the wealth, but they're not actually, what did you say, owning people?
Yeah, in other words, in a strictly statistical sense,
mm-hmm.
You can, in an ethical sense, we could have an argument, we could have a discussion about whether or not that really is a meaningful distinction. But legally, since it's really illegal to physically own another human being
mm-hmm.
in the United States, that doesn't mean, so that wouldn't, that shouldn't mean be confused with the capacity of wealth to control other people. So that even if you measure wealth as what one owns, there's still a large sphere of power that radiates outward from that wealth,
mm-hmm.
which is the capacity to subordinate others, the capacity to control others, the capacity to direct others, their labor, their practices, their activities. And this, I think, is where things get really insidious, because this is the kind of place where most, I guess, liberal kind of intellectuals tend not to go. But it's where
Why?
I think because I think our culture, the way our civilization's been structured around a kind of essentially liberal principle, has been one that says the economic structure of a capitalist society is one where ownership and inequality are going to have to be acceptable features to the community, and the best we can do is kind of mitigate the excesses of that wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, and on the other hand, just allow an equality of opportunity for others to be able to participate competitively in that society. What they don't want to see, or what they might, with arguing with
well, let me interrupt. Do you feel that in the United States right now that there's equal opportunity for all to become one of, like the 401st family?
No, definitely not. That's why I said this is part of the liberal. I would say it's an illusion, or better, it's an ideology.
Michael, I want to be the 401st.
Yeah, of course, and that's the illusion. The illusion is that you can do it, because the idea is that, well, if you work hard and career is open to talent.
Keep buying those lottery tickets, huh?
Yeah, keep buying the lottery tickets. Keep buying the lottery ticket, and there's just, and I think that's why it goes back to the statistics we were talking about before. The structure, the social structure, the thing that people can't really see because it doesn't physically exist, nevertheless exists.
Mm-hmm.
And these structures they direct and orient and constrain us the way any physical structure would.
Okay.
And the inequality should be seen really as the architecture of that structure. Just the way, any building is built,
mm-hmm.
the way you would walk around a building to get to one part of it to the other is constrained by the way its hallways are designed, or where the staircases are, where the elevators are. No different from social structure. Even though it's not cement and concrete, nevertheless, inequality really is a descriptor for the shape of that social structure and the kind of constraints it places on some and the kind of capacities it grants to others.
Now we're a democracy, right? I mean, can't we decide where the halls lead us to?
The extent to which we're a democracy is questionable. I think that what we live in is a kind of originally started as a property-owning republic,
mm-hmm.
where political power was constrained to a very small segment of the population, and throughout the 19th and 20th century, that conservative republic has been stretched.
Now, wait a second.
Shaped out.
Again, this is why I love your book. Our founding fathers, our founders, they were rebelling from European feudalism, and what's the first line of the Declaration of Independence? We the people have a right to blah de blah. So they weren't thinking property ownership, were they?
I would say that
you're about to commit a mortal sin here, Michael. So Jesus is watching. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that the particular. Well, first of all, to answer it broadly, I think the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are clearly not only are they different documents, but they're also documents that are written from two different political perspectives in history.
Mm-hmm.
The Declaration of Independence is a document written, a statement of principles about what we want.
Okay.
The Constitution is written from the perspective of we threw off the shackles, now we should be careful about what we've unleashed.
Okay.
So in many ways, the Constitution can be read in some ways as a counter-revolutionary document. It's an attempt through the architecture, a legal architecture of the state, to prevent the spread of the revolutionary logic.
Okay.
I mean, if you think about it, first of all, the idea that they revolted against feudalism clearly can't be maintained, since southern states were still feudal and they still had human slavery and were based off of a property, property kind of feudal system, penetrating well into the 20th century. That system lasted, even though without the legal slavery. Second of all, and in addition, to maintain the incorporation of those southern states into this new republic, they had to grant them bigger concessions than the northern states. The Three-Fifths Compromise, the Electoral College, things that some of which stay with us today, which give them disproportionate political power.
Mm-hmm.
As with respect to the northern states, and I think with respect to like the framers, I think that the Constitution in many ways was designed to solve what they saw to be the twin problems stemming back to antiquity, to the Greek world, about popular government, which was on the one extreme.
Now, wait. What was so important about the southern states that they had to be given the Electoral College and all that? Was it because they were a lot smarter than the rest of the world?
They were much more wealth-producing than the northern states.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to remember that the Articles of Confederation really were a political disaster. Each state was going to have its own money, each state was going to have its own army,
Mm-hmm.
And the central state was going to be weak. When the Federalist Papers were written to try to argue for and not really persuade the idea that they should have a federal system as opposed to a confederal system, then the idea became you're going to need a strong state, and that people and the satellite states are going to have to sign on to this federal system.
Mm-hmm.
Southern states were saying, we're not going to get involved with this because a central power is what we fought against, which was a king.
Mm-hmm.
And so to entice them to join this union, they had to be given concessions. And politically smart on the one hand, but risky on the other.
Mm-hmm.
When he ran for his second term and won, which was in order to kind of project unity, he chose a vice president who was a Southerner and a
Mm-hmm.
Democrat. So when he unexpectedly was assassinated, the attempts to rearrange the social order in the South by the radical Republicans, people like Thaddeus Stevens and the rest, of redistributing property and emancipating slaves and bringing them into a property-owning system by redistributing the old plantations of the South,
Mm-hmm.
that whole Reconstruction plan was sacked, and the southern states were able to reconsolidate power and instigate the Jim Crow system.
All right.
So in many ways, even though, yes, the North militarily won the battle, a federal system, the federal system of unity was maintained, it's pretty clear that for the next 150 years, a system of racial feudalism persisted in the South.
All right. And since we're on this topic, in your book, you mentioned the southernization of the Midwest. I think you were quoting someone else, but it was in your book. Do you recall that?
So one of the things that starts to happen is, particularly after World War II, is a kind of movement of factory industrial production,
Mm-hmm.
into the South, but also this kind of transformation of much of the country into a kind of post-industrial kind of society, and this has had a lot to do with inequality.
Mm-hmm.
This was part of the the Sun Belt and the Southern strategy and electoral politics. Much of this had to do with the fact that capital was seeking to leave those places where there were union controls, strong worker solidarity movements, and which were basically biting into surplus profits. So there was not an attempt, it was a successful move to keep shifting capital to the South, to the Southeast, inevitably to where we are now. Capital's moved almost completely for industrial production offshore. And this has had a lot to do with the expansion of inequality in the United States, for sure. The key idea throughout human history, like human civilization, is how can elites maintain power over a majority? How can a minority maintain authority and control over a majority? Because mathematically, it shouldn't be that way. 1 million people should be able to control 200 people.
So
the key,
what's gone wrong?
Yeah, well, I think what's happened is, I think one of the most salient forces that's really happened, that's really had impact since the 1970s in particular, has been the aggressive expansion of the market, not just as an economic mechanism, but as a transformer of our society. That our society, our social reality.
Now, when you say the market, you're not talking about the stock market.
No, I'm talking about the idea of buying and selling, the idea of exchange, of everything for exchange, the idea that all social relationships become modeled after the relationship of market mechanisms and market exchanges, that you begin to see other people as commodities or means to ends, that this is a really important anthropological shift in our culture. It changes the way we see other people. It changes the way we see our own selves and our own aspirations, and it changes the legitimacy of why we see this. What we see the purpose of politics as being. The purpose of politics now should be to guarantee, a stable market, not to guarantee, other forms of value like ethical values or moral values or values of freedom or self-realization or self-development or security. And this has been a big transformation because, other forms of life, the United States really was at one time a society of communities that were very, kind of linked together. People had, civic associations, religious associations, and these have been inexorably through the course of the 20th and early 21st century metabolized down by the market. The market is like a big machine kind of breaking everything down into its constituent atomistic parts. And I think that is probably the most salient transformation. And when that happens, when you see yourself as alone, when you see yourself, when you're no longer part of solidaristic groups or solidaristic institutions, then your life starts to change. You don't think about politics as much anymore because you really don't think you can change anything.
Mm-hmm.
You don't look on your own, your own personal values start to change because you feel you're competing with others. A new kind of anxiety sets in about whether you're going to have what you need, and health care or other kinds of security. All these kinds of things kind of set in, and it transforms us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely not I'm not suggesting that it's a permanent shift, but the pattern, I think it's pretty clear. Inequality does not. This is the big misconception I think that most people have, is that inequality leads to a kind of inevitably a snap reaction by the public, by the downtrodden, that they want justice, and therefore revolution or rebellion or some kind of reform will take
on one
place.
hand, you're saying we're like goldfish swimming in an apathy stew, but now you're saying that there's going to be some sort of reflexive reaction that the public as a whole.
Mistake. I think that's a mistake. That's what I'm saying. That a lot of people have that misconception. It's actually the opposite. The more that inequality increases, actually the less political people get, the more reconciled to the system people become. And this is kind of one of the things about history that most people don't realize, is that revolutions and revolutionary change tends to happen when there's hope that's been built up, and people want to take it to the next level faster than it's willing to be given to them by elites. But as inequality increases and people...
Now, wait. I want that. I'm 62 years old, Michael. I don't want to wait and hope that maybe the next generation starts fixing things. I won't be around for that.
Yeah. I think that's the right thing. The right time for action is always now, But I think what happens as inequalities expand, the general psychological pattern among people in terms of civic life tends to be that they recede from the civic world because they feel themselves less empowered. Mm-hmm. And the less empowered people feel themselves to be, the less informed they will be about politics, the less they'll read about politics, the less they'll care about politics, mm-hmm. and the more reconciled they'll be to the system, and the more that they'll resign themselves to the way things are. And that's one of the really corrosive effects of inequality, is that it really does stultify people's political knowledge and political activity.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Do you have anything optimistic to add to this?
Yeah,
something to keep me from crying.
Okay, so it's like, let's dispel the myths before we can talk about more politically viable things. There's no question that people like Marx, I think, had this kind of thing right, and the early Marxists of the 20th century, who were mm-hmm. The more democratically minded. That the thing about a modern capitalist society is from an historical vantage point, is that human beings now are in closer proximity to understanding their social interdependence on others than they were in, say, feudal times or other periods in history. That the more urban, the more metropolitan, the more that we're kind of crammed together, we kind of should start to see our fate as interlaced with one another. Mm-hmm. And I think the more that we're able to do that and push that, the more that we'll be able to foster a sense of consciousness about a kind of alternative reality. It's pretty clear that what's been happening recently in politics, particularly within the Democratic Party, is you're starting to see a more radical discourse about wealth distribution. You're starting to see them talk about people like Elizabeth Warren or Ocasio-Cortez about, 70% upper bracket wealth taxes. There's even, I've seen some calls for, articles here and there, for the question, the ethical, political question, whether or not billionaires should even be allowed to exist. Right? So when you get to that point, then it's pretty clear there's a reason for optimism. If it's handled right, if it doesn't descend into some kind of, anarchism. I mean, the question, the relevant political question is, are there going to be social movements and groups that are able to harness this properly and fight for policies that
all right,
that really benefit the common good?
Let's put our science fiction hat on for a second, okay? Elizabeth Warren gets elected. The House remains in held by the Democrats. Now you get into the electoral system that our flawless founding fathers put in place, and that the Senate remains in control of the Republicans, who think it's who are, I'm going to throw out a phrase, laissez-faire.
Right.
Then what?
Then you can see how, going back to the initial part of our conversation, why the Constitution was in many ways a counter-revolutionary document. That if the Senate is able to halt radical reform, then that is exactly what the framers intended. And I do think that's what they intended, and I think that's what would probably happen. What you need is, for certain, and here's where things get tricky, what you need is segments of the society to see that we all share a common risk from the way that the society is headed. It's only then that there will be a common franchise for really serious reform. It can't only be...
Michael, have you ever been to a Trump rally?
I have never been to a Trump rally.
Yeah, I think you're a little pie in the sky here, bud. There's no way you're going to get these people to come around.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that's going to happen.
Oh,
but I will say that's the only way. You're right. In an electoral system, it's the only way to get these. Okay. So, for example, that's exactly what happened during the New Deal. There was no way that middle-class people and working-class people saw eye to eye on anything until the middle class and the working class both realized that the system is so dangerously insecure that we really need a system that covers everyone. And so things had to get that bad, in other words, for this kind of solidarity to emerge.
I'm crying again, Michael. I'm crying again.
I know. It's sad. It's sad. It's sad. It really is. And I mean, what can you say? What can you say? If you don't have...
All right. I grew up, and the 60s were really cool. And, kids were getting drafted. So they revolted. And, a few of them got shot at Kent State. But other than that, they made themselves heard. And maybe the Vietnam War ended because of that. There was the point being there was change.
Yeah.
Now, all right, let me change the subject just a little bit, and let me throw this provocative thing out there. Is democracy as we know it a lid on change? Did you hang up on me?
No. I would say that I don't think it's a lid on change.
Give me an example.
I'll say probably the years from 1935 to 1965 are probably the most
Again, you're talking New Deal and the ripple effect thereafter.
ripple effect through the civil rights movement, and the beginnings of the war on poverty. That period, right? That 30-year period, saw more social transformation in the United States through relatively conservative democratic institutions because of the power of social movements.
Mm-hmm.
So the institutions were definitely designed in the beginning to serve as a lid for transformation. I totally see that. But there's been 2 centuries of reworking that have transformed those institutions in such a way that the only way elites now can really control the masses is through some degree of a manipulation of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, I mean, you know, if you think about the great reforms of the progressive era from like 1872 through, 1914, 1920, say, you see these things like, senators were appointed until 1912. After 1912, they were elected by the public.
Mm-hmm.
You see the emergence of referenda and plebiscitary type of voting for local and state level elections. There were a lot of expansion of popular government under the progressive era. And what's interesting about that is that it had mixed results. I mean, on the one hand, there were some progressive legislation that passed, but on the other hand, there was also an explosion of racist, anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese sentiment that came from tapping into this populist demagoguery kind of sentiment. So what you need are social movements that really have a kind of maturity in view, like the civil rights movement, like the workers' movement, or poor people's movements of the 1960s, that are able to make specific, really democratically oriented kinds of transformation. I don't think the institutions can stand in the way of that anymore. I think tomorrow, if the science fiction hat on again, that if, let's just do a thought experiment. Let's imagine we did something that was different from the founding fathers and said, instead of having a property requirement to vote, that there was a negative income or wealth requirement to serve in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
That if you had $1 million or more, you were barred from running for elections or serving as Congress. What would it look like then?
Well, then you would just have the people with $1 million buying the politicians, because you're allowed to buy politicians nowadays.
True. But what if you started to reform those kinds of practices, those kind of reforms which could lead to more expanded types of legislation? And I'll tell you, here in New York, in New York and New Jersey, and the past election cycle overturned many of these established politicians, and they were from people who had no money.
Mm-hmm.
Is it impossible? Of course not. I mean, it's happened. Is it likely that that's going to happen all the time? No. But I can't say that the institution the electoral institutions are constraints.
I do need to interrupt yet again. Sorry, I'm rude, but I must say that you guys, that Cortez young lady is smoking hot. So thank you for that.
No, she's great. And, think about it. She's pushing not only, for the Green New Deal, pushing for the wealth tax. I mean, these are bold ideas. These are really bold ideas that are getting into the discussion of the Democratic Party. And look, the fact that you had to have Trump at his State of the Union address even mention the word socialism is great, because that's exactly how you want them to start thinking. Elites have to know
Isn't
that it's a
socialism a crime?
Socialism is a crime? I didn't know that if it was legally a crime.
Well, I know that it's definitely a cudgel, a blunt instrument when you're in politics to throw that around.
For sure, for sure. But, it's losing that power now on younger voters.
But they don't go to the voting booth.
They don't, but there's more of them, and they're going to be the future one way or the other. So there's not going to be much you can do about it.
Oh, man. All right, speaking of socialism being a bad word, I'm going to throw something at you about reverse socialism. I came to Cleveland, Ohio, and most people never even heard of the place other than the Republican convention or something like that, but they have heard of the river burning. It was everyone was polluting the river. There's no one bad guy, but the big fire that brought national attention to it was caused, everyone thinks, by this one company, this steel company. Now, and by the way, our second interview or third interview or something like that was with one of the founders of the EPA, one of the guys assigned to create and draw that up, but. That was one of the precipitating factors that created the EPA, which is, in effect, a national tax on everyone. A lot of people that had nothing to do with the burning river or the pollution in Los Angeles. And I forget what the third cause was. But anyways, in other words, the whole nation had to pay for the polluters of the Cuyahoga River.
Yeah.
Now, if you go down to the site of where that burning took place and look at that factory, it's been empty for 20 years. And yet, the rest of the country paid for the sins of that corporation. That's a real micro example. We can talk about 2008 in the banks and having to bail them out. Isn't there a socialism where the beneficiaries are the wealthy, are the capitalists?
I'm reluctant to call that as kind of socialism. I'm definitely willing to call it a kind of, and I could tell you why in a minute. But I definitely think that this is part of the way that economic elites, many of a century ago, structured their relationship to the state and to society as players within society that were so important that society and the state should bail them out when they need it, or their ability to just walk away from what they've done is protected. And I think that, as opposed from being socialism, it's simply, I think, a form of elite protection that they've been able to construct around themselves. Socialism, really, this is a big term with lots of different, traditions around it. Really, at the nucleus of it is the concept, as far as I'm concerned, is the concept that what always has to take precedence is that we are fellows. That's the word. The Latin word is socii. We're fellows in a community of interdependent, cooperative community, and what we do should always be for that common benefit of all. And I can't. If it's a socialism in reverse, then that does too much violence to the term. I just think that's what capitalism is. I don't think capitalism is that pure theory of buying, producing widgets, selling them at this price, paying a wage, investment. No, capitalism is, that's too clean of a concept. That comes out of the econ textbooks. If you really look at what capitalism really is, in all of its blood and dirt and everything that's around it. It is a very human, aggressive, and is almost always tied up with some kind of violence. And I think no matter where you go, you see this. I mean, the investment that was used.
When you say violence,
loans,
are you talking
yes.
like the very few is having prison sex with the many? I had to be provocative there.
Yeah, you know what? Yes. You know, and interesting that you bring that up in that way, because I was thinking, when you mentioned this before, I was thinking about, one of the great thinkers in the history of political thought that dealt with the question of, he wrote before capitalism even existed, but wrote about the powers of the wealthy. Was Niccolo Machiavelli, the great Italian political theorist.
Mm-hmm.
And Machiavelli wrote a book called The Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy. And it is a masterpiece of, if you want to understand how wealth obtains political power and what it does. And Machiavelli has a simple concept. He says, he calls them the grandi, the great, the rich. He says, what they want is, and he uses an interesting word in Italian. The word he uses is the verb usurpare, to usurp.
Mm-hmm.
The rich want to usurp the people. They want to usurp the city. And the interesting thing about that word is Latin. There's actually two different Latin words put together, which is usu, to use, and rapere, to rape, to use for one's ends.
Wow.
And the word he uses is usurapere, that they usurp. They want to usurp the people. They want to dominate them. They want to oppress them. And these are the words, opprimere, he says in Italian. He says, use the word oppress, usurp, subordinate, control. That's what capitalism really is at its core. The widget and the wage and all this other stuff, those are economic window dressings. At its core, it is a relationship of power.
Mm-hmm.
And a relationship of power is intrinsically political. And socialism, as I see it, is a kind of anti-power against those kinds of elites, about their capacity to accumulate enough of wealth, which is the primary resource of power in human societies, their incapacity to accumulate enough wealth to be able to use other people for their own means. And that's key. And I think,
is that kind of like Walmart when they don't pay their people enough, so the people have to be on food stamps, and so the rest of the country pays for Walmart workers?
That's the idea.
Huh.
And you have to remember something. You also have to remember something historically. State government, whether it's the Spanish, financing the conquistadors, or whether it was the French financing, French companies to go over to Vietnam, or the English financing the companies to go into India, the government always took a loss so that the corporations would profit. The government knew they were taking a loss because the people controlling the government and the people controlling the corporations were from the same class. So, you could say like, oh, well, all the rubber plantations in Vietnam when the French had Southeast Asia as their colony, and like Michelin rubber. We have tires from today, still tire corporations that are French. These companies use slave labor, brutal forms of slave labor. And every time there was kind of an uprising by the Vietnamese or some kind of terrorist, anti-colonial terrorism, the leaders of Michelin would say to the French government, you got to send the army over here and then suppress this. And the state government would collect taxes from their own workers and their own people to fund these military operations far away to suppress these rebellions so that private capital could accumulate, could reestablish the regime of accumulation. And the way I see this is that the example you described is just the same structure of that.
Mm-hmm.
That if Goldman Sachs wants to screw around and, trade in fictitious capital and gamble money on all these derivatives and things, that's fine. Because the truth is, the people who were head of the organs of the state, like the Federal Reserve or the Department of the Treasury, were also in a revolving door relationship with the big banks of Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
They're the same people. And I'm not going to say like, oh, it's a big game rigged for that, but of course it is. Of course that's what it is. And the idea is, yes, are they too big to fail? Yeah, it's too big for capitalism would have collapsed in 2008.
Well,
it would have
let's
collapsed.
suppose. Now, there's a contradiction in what you're saying here, Michael, because you were saying moments ago that something needs to get really bad in order for there to be change. Wouldn't that have been one of those bad moments where we could have had some change if we just would have said,
change.
Fuck you? Go ahead.
You could have had change, but here's my question to you.
Mm-hmm.
When things get bad, they don't always change for the better.
Arab Spring.
Arab Spring is an example.
Mm-hmm.
And Weimar Germany is another example.
Mm-hmm.
That Hitler and Mussolini rise to power, or Franco.
He wasn't so
power.
bad. He just has bad press nowadays.
Revisionism. No, it. You can get a situation where, or Russia today, or Hungary, or when things get so bad that people do not turn to democratic, enlightened paths for change. That they choose, authoritarian means of change. That's always the danger in history. The danger is that the experiment may fail, that 1789 leads to Napoleon, that 1848 leads to, the great, counter-revolution in 1851, that the 60s experimentation in culture and the welfare state, expansion of the welfare state, leads to 1980 and the counter-revolution that we've been under, of neoliberalism, of Reagan, Thatcher, that we're still living under. That's the historical dilemma. There's no science to this, and there's no way to guarantee an end. But this is the kind of historical perspective you need to understand why movements can't take things for granted, and why citizens can't take things for granted.
What's Thomas Edison once said he was never a genius. He just had no problems with trial and error. Wouldn't letting everything just go to shit in 2008? Sure, it might have turned out bad. We might have had Hitler or Trump, or whatever. But at least we tried. But we bent over in the prison shower.
Yeah, I think actually what you've got is, since the 1950s, we've had 67, almost 70 years now, I guess, of an affluent society, materially affluent society, that has made people lose sight of what it means to go back to see what it was like before that, and that people don't realize that the kind of system that was put in place after 1945, that expanded, that created the middle class. The middle class is a creation, a legal political creation of the social democratic consensus of Western European and American capitalism, and this is starting to fall apart now. That the kind of tax redistributive mechanisms, legal mechanisms, property owning all these kinds of things that were put in place, this thick structure of legal policies and legal structures, economic tax policies, all these things have been slowly eroding and being reformed in favor of the elite, that I think it's going to be like waking up after a long 50-year slumber. And someday it's going to be one generation really just hits rock bottom. that the family's wealth has petered out. The wealth that was built up by the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the baby boomer generation. My parents were baby boomers. The kind of, the inability of people to buy a house or have health insurance, that you see it happening now. It's happening. But there's going to be one generation where I think that the tide turns, and it's just going to be a quality shift.
If you had a generation that came and went and had those changes and made those things possible, that would be one hell of a generation.
Yes, it would be.
And
it would be.
And I'm purposely setting you up for this next question, because I think the most brilliant line from your book, you're the first guy to ever say this land is mine and set out the stakes. Do you remember writing that?
Yeah, that's actually a quote from Rousseau.
Oh, fucking take it for your... Michael, come on.
And Rousseau famously says that the first person who set out a plot of land, put a fence around it, said it was his, and here's the important line, and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. And that's an interesting line, because I think what Rousseau is saying is, for them to have the power, we have to assent to it. Found people simple enough to believe him is the key line. And because the next sentence is great,
also,
which I didn't
mentioned
quote, which
the
he says,
people,
yeah, go ahead.
The responsibility of the people to say, fuck you.
Absolutely.
And that's the generation I'm begging for.
That's the generation that really needs to come out, especially, and this is why I say about Machiavelli, why Machiavelli is so important. Machiavelli says this. He said, like the elites have to be afraid. The people need to basically be able to vent their anger. He calls them tumults, where they go out in the street and just wreck stuff. Machiavelli even says that the people should be able to have public trials of the wealthy if they abuse the common interest. And in extreme cases, Machiavelli says there should be executions for people with wealth if they abuse the common interest. Now, this is Renaissance Italy, so things are a little different, but the principle is the same, because he says that the reason this is important isn't for redistribution. This isn't a liberal welfare argument, like we need to redistribute them through taxes. This argument is about political. This is about, he says, restraining their arrogance. Because their arrogance is what gives them that more arrogant they get, the more timid the people become, and then you slide from a republic into an oligarchy. And then there's no freedom possible. And that's important. People have to have a civic virtue about saying, who the hell are you that you can, dictate to us what to buy, what's beautiful, what music we should listen to, what television shows we should watch. Who are you? And that once that moment happens, then the whole illusion can come crumbling down. The whole illusion will come crumbling down. And,
how do you make that happen?
I don't know.
God damn it, you're the smart guy in the room.
But it's happened before. I mean, if you think about the 1960s, as a kind of reaction to a lot of things, but one of the things it was a reaction to clearly was the 1950s and the kind of repression at the sexual level of sexuality, of culture, of everything, norms, family structure. I mean, the 60s really, at its best, is a kind of cultural revolution against a lot of things that were stultifying. I think what neoliberalism learned from the 60s was you're not going to be able to go back to Father Knows Best, even though the Trump people want that. But you will be able to take certain things from the 60s and make people, not feel repressed, but still have them in a position of subordination. And I think that's the situation we're in now. This is unique. We're not repeating a pattern. This is a new hybrid of, you know, let people watch porn. Let people like the sex.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to be sexually uptight. You know, Pepsi likes gay people.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine. Just keep buying our shit. So you're going to have to get to the point where there's a new kind of cultural sensibility that starts to set in against the kind of alienation of commodified culture, and people to be able to link that consciousness of that commodified culture with the power structure that is destroying the planet, that is making them responsible for student loans, that is depriving them of all these kind of common goods that other people have
Mm-hmm.
in places like Europe. And that connection's not difficult to make. That's not difficult to make. And I think actually in many ways that people are starting to make these connections. And I think there's going to be a point where, and you can never predict this because it just doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a point where all this comes together at the right moment. I mean, nobody predicted Occupy Wall Street. I mean,
when can I start buying or manufacturing guillotines?
Yeah.
That's
so
the point.
I think when that happens, then you know you're gonna be in a situation where if we can't resolve these questions within the structure of the Republican constitutional system we have,
The structure, by the way, that the people have nothing to do with, the structure that those 400 control every hallway, every doorway, and control the people who walk through the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
I say we start making guillotines. Talk me off that ledge.
I think first of all, the history of that is
it's not pretty, I know.
Well, it's not just
a few heads
pretty.
would roll.
A few heads would roll, I know. And Machiavelli says something similar, right? He says the same idea, like, you know, a couple of executions and exiles, and, you know, the rest of them will get the hint, kind of thing. Roosevelt, in many ways, did it just as well without the.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Go ahead.
You go there and you say, you know, you need someone with a pair, basically. You need someone who's going to go up and say, you know, what Obama did not do with the health care thing. And I'll tell you an example. Like, when Obama got elected and he's like, we're going to sit all the players down, insurance companies, medical companies, you know, we're going to sit everyone down. Yeah. And I'm like, that is exactly the thing you do not do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something Roosevelt would have done. Like, Roosevelt would have said, like, he would have sat them down and said, like, here's the deal.
Now Roosevelt was a wealthy guy.
Like this. Yes.
I don't know if you've ever
but
read
he's a
the
wealthy
book,
guy who saw...
Douglas Carswell.
No.
He's a British MP, and he's talking about, you know, from a British perspective and the oligarchy that exists there, that it takes an oligarch to break from the herd and to say, hey, if you don't want guillotines, we've got to change. We've got to make some changes, a la Roosevelt. I don't see us having a Roosevelt in the crystal ball.
Well, first of all, I definitely think that it's true. Roosevelt was one of the elites. He was from the elite family.
Mm-hmm.
But what he does show is that you don't need to be one of them. I think I mean, Lincoln's an example. I mean, you could have someone from humble origins who would be able to,
mm-hmm.
with real virtue, protect the common good by using any means necessary. And I think that, you know, the thing about Roosevelt that's interesting is that he, I mean, the stuff about him being a traitor to his class and stuff, that was all the rhetoric of of the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
The truth of the matter is people were afraid because of the way he reorganized the architecture of the state. And he reorganized the architecture of the state to be pro-worker and pro-public.
Mm-hmm.
And it has taken conservatives and some liberals too. It's taken them a long time to really try to reorient that direction. We're still not completely. We're still living within that structure that Roosevelt created for the most part.
Or the remnants of it.
The remnants of it, but there are important remnants of it. I mean, the expansion of state power, the intervention, the legal interventionism of the executive branch,
mm-hmm.
the capacity to regulate. Yes, a lot of this stuff's been, chopped, chiseled away. But the fact that it was done once means it can be done again. And I think that is another part of this, that social movements have to push candidates who are willing to, and they have to show, like, you need to go the distance. You need to go the distance, and you need to be able to clip the wings of capital. And if you're not, and I think the problem is, the thing that's limiting that ability isn't so much the unwillingness to do it from a moral perspective. I really think it is a technical question. And here's where Marx would be really relevant, because Marx's point is that capitalism always puts you in a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, you need it to maintain the material quality of life that you have. On the other hand, it's the very thing that's subordinating you
mm-hmm.
and controlling you. So liberals basically find themselves in the position of, like, we don't like the excesses of it, but it's perfectly necessary, because without capitalism, where are people going to work? What are people going to do? How are we going to create value? How are we going to pay people things? Like, there's no alternative system in view. I think it's like in the medieval world, like, people would have said, like, well, if we don't have a king and a lord, like, what the hell, who's going to run everything? Like, there was just no cognitive capacity to imagine a world beyond that. And I think, like, our elites aren't at that point yet where they can actually see that there's a future embedded in the present.
What?
And I think that's a problem.
Can I throw out an idea? And again, I'm trying to get ratings here, so I'm going to be provocative.
Right.
What about if would it be a wake-up call if, say, California, Washington, and Oregon just said, thanks but no thanks, we're going off on our own?
It would be a wake-up call for sure. It would be a wake-up call if people started to break away and say, we don't want to be part of this contract. I could see California and New York
mm-hmm.
and cities like states like that, or New Jersey doing it. They would say, well, we give, for every tax dollar we send to Washington, we get back 70 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And for every tax dollar people from Arkansas and Louisiana send, they get $1.50. So we're basically funding these people who basically politically, legally, and culturally are running against our own interests, our values. Why we'd rather be an independent city-state than be part of this social contract.
That's a good note to end on, because the theme of this entire web series is self-destruction, and that the end of civilizations are because people are on a self-destructive bent. Yeah, you definitely put a pin on that one. And we've gone over an hour, Michael, and so I've abused your time.
I had no idea. It went so fast.
Oh, dude, well, you're
like
one smart motherfucker. I'm glad
so
I got you on the phone. And I love your book. What's the name of the book?
The Politics of Inequality.
All right. And if we ever talk again, I'm going to put a magic wand in your hand right now. All right. And I want you to think about it. If you could wave that, how would you fix this? All right. Don't answer now, because we're going to have listeners turning off anyway. So, but maybe at some future time, tell me what you do with that magic wand. All right.
Okay. I'm ready.
All right, brother. Keep up the good work, and thank you for
All
your
right, John,
time.
you too. Thanks, man. Take it easy.
All right, bye.
Bye.